Welcome and thank you for being with us. A friendly reminder that Mount Holyoke reserves the right to record this session and that no other recording is permitted. In this webinar, Dr. Leslie Sandra Jones, an alum of the class of 1977 and associate professor of biology at Valdosta State University, shares about the biology of human skin color. Please note that the presentation contains sensitive imagery in reference to race and slavery. Dr. Jones is going to share a bit more about herself in her presentation. So at this point, we will turn things over to her.
Well, thank you very much. It's nothing less than a real honor to be doing something with Mount Holyoke people. It's just, there's never a better time in your life than when you're in college. And I feel my heart goes out to the students right now that they're going through all of this and can't be on campus. But if this can add a little bit to it, I hope it will. I want to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I got into doing this. I'm a kind of a hybrid. I use the chameleon as a metaphor because I'm a hybrid between a biologist and a science educator. And I dwell between these two different academic worlds. In the natural sciences, my specialization was equine reproductive physiology. But I don't do any more of that. I'm still interested in it, but I just don't do that research anymore. I'm working now on interactive learning online, and I started this well before COVID put all of us in this online situation. So it's a real timely topic to be working on. On the educational side, as a social scientist, I'm a science teacher educator and a very committed anti-racist biology instructor. So that's kind of these two different roles that I occupy. And I really look at this as something that involves people's worldviews. And I want to give you a little background on mine so you'll know where I'm coming from. Everybody's worldview is shaped by their personal experiences. And this is a picture of my father's submarine. My father was a submarine officer. So I grew up all over the country and to a certain extent all over the world. Because we traveled a lot, and I went to 13 schools before I graduated from high school and headed up to Mount Holyoke. I predominantly grew up in Hawaii when I was really young, and this has a very, very important impact on what I'm speaking about. We lived over on the other side of the island. Pearl Harbor is in this region, but we lived way across the island because my father spent a lot of time away on deployments in the Western Pacific or around Vietnam. It was during the Vietnam War, and we were lucky enough to be living on the windward side of Oahu. And one of the things about growing up in Hawaii is people talk about Hawaii being a melting pot, but it isn't blending all into one thing. In Hawaii, we don't talk about being colorblind because everyone is very conscious of their ancestry. And we learned a lot about Hawaiian culture. I went to regular schools, Hawaiian schools, and it was just a really good time to grow up in an environment where you were made very conscious of who you were and what role you played in it all. And I think the biggest impact it had on me personally was that whiteness was not invisible in Hawaii. In fact, whiteness was very visible because it situated me as a haole in Hawaiian culture. Haole means ghost, and it's not a really complimentary term, but if you're a Caucasian, you know you're a haole and you deal with it. And you're not the top of the totem pole of life, or the bottom of it is really the higher point. But I grew up knowing who I was and a lot about racial ethnic issues when I lived there. My doctoral dissertation looked at the impact of racism and sexism in post-secondary science education. And that's what got me very interested in this subject. And the reason I have a picture of that door on this slide is because when I did a qualitative study and spoke to 35 practicing scientists that were half women, half men, half Caucasians, and half people of color, it was like a 2x2 factorial. One of the things that stunned me was that white women were not holding the doors open for anybody that came behind them. They didn't want to talk about affirmative action, and none of us would have been in the sciences without affirmative action. So it really had a tremendous impact on me. And I was always thinking, I don't want to be that kind of an educator because I really believe that I got into the sciences and was lucky to be there. And I think we owed it to other people to be working on things like that. So but for a long time, I wasn't working on these issues. And it wasn't until fairly recently I switched research lines, and I'm doing a lot of work on developing anti-racist biology curriculum. Now, I want to start the biology part out with the idea that every animal species has preferential sensory capabilities, and ours just happens to be vision. One of the first things any human notices, or we notice about each other, is our skin color. Yet most people are not very comfortable talking about this. And also, because we say so little about it in school, most people know very little about how skin color is inherited. And if only people did understand the whole process of human evolution and all of the new information that's coming out right now in genetics, it would be much easier to deal with this, and we could develop some good curriculum that helped Americans in school. But sadly, the scientific stories are taking a really long time to trickle down into the education system, and these are stories that are rarely told. I always teach it in any class I teach, because I teach a lot of biology classes that are teacher education content courses, and I want teachers to understand more about these issues. And even today in a general biology course, I gave a very similar lecture to this as one of the last things, because our students are going home next week for Christmas and they won't be coming back on campus. And I really kind of saved the best for last, because I think this is one of the most relevant subjects that I do teach them. Now, I want to start out by saying, and I think everybody knows this, Homo sapiens, our species, originated in Africa. So we're all of African descent. And modern humans all have exactly the same genes. What differs among people is the fact that mutations in our genome will cause variation. And when variation impacts a gene that has some kind of an influence on the survival and reproductive success of a person, it can be actively selected for or against in the process of natural selection. So advantageous genes undergo positive selection, and disadvantageous genes undergo negative selection. And that's what leads to differing alleles in different people. And I know this is a little bit of a genetics review, and don't worry, I'm not going to teach all genetics in here, but I've got to get some of the language out there so that the talk will make sense to everybody if you haven't had genetics in a long time or ever. So alleles are the different kinds of genes. We each have 2 alleles for every gene that we have in our genome. And one allele came from our mother and one came from the father. And if an allele confers some kind of an advantage, it will undergo positive selection. And the numbers of alleles in a population, that allele will increase. If it is a deleterious or a bad impact, it will undergo negative selection and be selected against. And the odds are that the gene will just disappear from the population. It won't become part of the whole accumulated gene pool. So among all the people on Earth, the only thing that varies are the allelic frequencies, the alleles, the different types of genes on each chromosome, and the distributions vary among different populations. When I refer to the gene pool, I'm talking about all of the alleles or all the gene varieties in one population. So starting out with our closest relative and most of the other great apes, the chimpanzee has very light skin under a very heavy, hairy coat. And when humans came out of the forest, dropped down and developed bipedalism, so we walked on 2 feet and had the use of our hands, we moved into different climate zones that were not the arboreal environments that our ancestors had lived in. And among the great apes that are shown here along this bar, the only one that has dark skin is the gorilla. All the others are light skin. Now, these, I want to be really careful that you understand, these are not our ancestors. I have to tell my students in South Georgia, this is not your great-great-grandmother, because evolution used to be very controversial down here. And their saying was always, I just don't believe I came from a monkey. Well, evolution doesn't say it came from a monkey. It refers to a common primate ancestor 5 to 6 billion years ago. But when humans when humans started to evolve and went through this path of hominin development, we lost a lot of our hair. We lost the heavy coats and developed more sweat glands. So with the loss of body hair, our skin was exposed to sunlight. And originally, when Homo sapiens and some of the ancestral forms, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and other genera of hominins, these are all human-like ancestral species. We're living in the equatorial regions of Africa. There was very strong natural selection for dark skin. And one of the things that happened before our species even existed, and this is what has just been discovered very recently, was that 2 million years ago, Homo sapiens are only about 150,000 years old. So way before our species came into existence, some of the hominin ancestral species went through a selective sweep for dark pigmentation. And a selective sweep means that a mutation occurred in one person, and it was so advantageous that their offspring had big advantages over other people. And that gene became a very prevalent and predominant part of the gene pool for those species. And you can look at this graph over here. The graph shows that a gene that started out at a very low frequency moved up to have 100% frequency within African populations. And whatever allele was on that site before became much less prevalent as the dark gene, which is known as MC1R, came into existence. The mobility of hominins, and hominins meaning several species of human ancestors, led to people moving around quite a bit in Africa. And actually, 2 species moved out of Africa, both our species, Homo sapiens, which are shown in red here, and Homo erectus, which is the ancestral species that might be our direct ancestors. That has not been worked out completely by anthropologists yet. And Neanderthals, which is a very closely related species to Homo sapiens, actually evolved out of Africa in the Middle East and Europe. Excuse me. So the paths of global migration pretty much looked like this. Sometime about 130,000 years ago, our species moved out of Africa. Some people headed up through the Middle East and over to Europe. Others headed down to Southeast Asia. A big path led up through Asia to Northern Asia and across a land bridge that existed at the time over to both North and South America, and Central America is included in that wave of migration. And as people moved around, they encountered very differing environmental conditions. The environmental conditions are not exactly what they are now, but they were very different then, and different in all these different places. And humans underwent natural selection for certain traits that gave them survival advantages in these places. But the thing that's so interesting now is, with all of the recent work that's being done in genomics and genetic investigations, the entire human gene pool is open for us to look at. And this has led to us understanding a whole lot more about our history. We know more about human evolution. We finally resolved the idea that, that one wave of one part of our species moved out of Africa, and they were debating 2 hypotheses for a really long time, the out of Africa and the multi-regional hypotheses. And the multi-regional has been given up if you ever had to learn that in a biology class. We know that it's the out of Africa hypothesis that really describes how Homo sapiens moved out of Africa and started to colonize the whole world. And the precise genetics that can be done in this day and age really reveal a tremendous amount about human evolution. Every time most people go through one of those genetic agencies and you send your DNA in to be analyzed, the companies are now having people check a box. And if you check a box that allows them to do research with your genetic information, they can look at all kinds of things, and patterns of ancestry are really starting to be very clear. So natural selection was acting on people in a lot of different places, and it did so by enhancing the survival and the reproductive success of various different populations. And as migration took place, gene pools started to change a great deal. Modern Africans have the greatest genetic variation of anybody who exists today. And this is because they've been around the longest in terms of the history of our species, and they've had more time for mutations to take place and those genes to be carried along in the African genome. What happened as people moved out of Africa was there was a huge bottleneck effect. And this is literally what it sounds like. The bottleneck in leaving Africa was that the few people that moved out of Africa to start the migrations around the world only had part of the original gene pool. And as such, there was a much more limited genetic composition to those populations. And each time humans got up and moved to settle a different place, you ended up with a confounding thing, which is called the founder effect. And the founder effect is where there's genetic reduction every time a new group gets up and starts a new settlement or a new population in a different place. So every move of Homo sapiens around the world reduced the variance in the alleles that the populations had. And while Africans are the most variable genetically, South Americans are just about the least variable genetically. They have all the same genes, and I don't want to make this confusing. We have all the same genes because we're all humans, and you have to have all the human genes. But there's less variation in this population. There are less varieties of different alleles, and this population is much more genetically similar than an African population would be. So, as we all know, today, human skin colors range from very dark to very pale. And we can literally put that trait on a spectrum like this. And if we literally enumerated or counted all the people that had different skin colors, the most prevalent skin color, or the mean for the human population, would be some kind of a medium brown. And there would be less people at the extremes on either end of this bell curve. Skin color is a polygenic trait, which means it's regulated by a lot of different genes. There's some speculation that there may be up to 100 different genes that all interact to regulate skin color. So this is not something that we know exactly, and we certainly haven't worked out anywhere near all of the control of the various aspects of skin color, but we've worked out enough of them, not me, because I'm not a geneticist, but people have worked out pretty much the regulation of some of the major traits in the major populations around the world. And you may or may not have heard, human skin color is literally enacted by two forms of a pigment called melanin. Eumelanin is a black-brown pigment, and pheomelanin is a red-yellow pigment. And it's the combination of these, the amount and the distribution of those two kinds of melanin that give people all the variation that we see in human skin colors. The melanocyte is a cell that's under the epidermis, and melanocytes produce both kinds of melanin. And the melanocytes distribute the melanosomes to different aspects of the epidermis. This is a dark-skinned person's actual tissue, and you see that there are a lot of dark pigments in the lower part of the epidermis itself. And this is a light-skinned person's tissue, and you can see that there's less pigmentation over there. And that's what gives people different skin colors. So the range of human phenotypes is something that is really ultimately behind the colors that we see all over the world. The other thing about skin color is it's also a multifactorial trait, which everybody probably knows. Multifactorial means the environment interacts with the genetics. And if you have the genetic possibilities of tanning, then if you go out in the sun and are exposed to ultraviolet radiation, your skin will become darker. If you don't have the genetic variants that allow for tanning, you're going to go out and get a sunburn, and it can be very painful if you happen to be Caucasian. But even African Americans with fairly dark skin, if they have not been exposed to the sun for a while and go out and get a heavy dose of ultraviolet solar radiation, they can get burns as well. So it's not just something that white people get. We're all subjected to ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and that has a lot to do with why we ended up with different skin colors. The genetic ability to tan is usually seen in people outside of Africa, because this particular genetic part of skin color determination came about in places with a lot of climatic variation. If the climate goes from really hot to really cold, you'll go through periods of time where you're exposed to a lot of sunlight or less sunlight. And tanning is a genetic adaptation that allows people to change their skin color depending on what the climate is at a certain time of year. So the location that people existed in really changed the amount of ultraviolet radiation that they were exposed to. Most of you are going to think right away, well, natural selection must have been influenced by skin cancer, because it's something that, especially in Caucasian communities, people worry a lot about. But Caucasians are not the only people that can get skin cancer. Africans can get melanoma and some of the different types of skin cancers as well. But the amount of epidermal melanin you have definitely increases resistance to skin cancer. So the more melanin, or the darker someone's skin is, the less cancer risk they have. And light-skinned people know that they're very sensitive to burning and are very apt to be vulnerable to skin cancers. But you got to think about when we get skin cancer. Who gets skin cancer? Not usually children, and not even usually young adults. We get skin cancer when we're old, like I'm feeling right now. And if old people get skin cancer in their post-reproductive years, this is not going to be what influences natural selection. Natural selection is influenced by reproductive success. So if you're post-reproductive and get skin cancer, it's not going to impact the genes in your population. Instead, ultraviolet radiation presents two severe challenges to humans. One is that humans need enough penetration of ultraviolet light to produce vitamin D, which is necessary for binding of calcium. And this has been known for quite a long time. I mean, a lot of people take vitamin D supplements, and we've known this particular necessity for some exposure to sunlight. But the one that's just been discovered recently is that ultraviolet radiation also protects a very critical vitamin known as folic acid, or vitamin B9. Folic acid is destroyed if too much ultraviolet radiation gets into the skin. And it's the protection of vitamin B9 that's sort of the other side of the coin in skin color determination. So we've known for a long time that vitamin D synthesis is important because it enhances calcium absorption and may have other impacts on disease states. You can get rickets if you don't get enough vitamin D, and that's been well known for a long time. So in the United States, we fortify milk with vitamin D in the hopes that enough people will get it in their diets that they don't get vitamin D deficiencies. But people that are not getting enough sunlight or drinking fortified milk are very likely to develop vitamin D deficiencies, and doctors know to test people if they're not exposed to much sunlight and be sure that their diet's including enough exogenous vitamin D. The opposite part of this is the fact that in reducing photolytic damage of folate, what dark skin does is protect DNA and prevent many of the anomalous conditions that will happen if you get too much sunlight and don't retain enough folic acid during reproduction itself. Now, it's not widely known, but folic acid is critical for sperm production, brain function and hearing. But what we do know, and any of the women that are watching that have gone through pregnancies probably took pregnancy vitamins that had a lot of folate in them, because that reduces pregnancy loss and the incidence of the birth defect spina bifida. Now, the interesting part of this is that spina bifida is a birth defect that's going to take shape in the very early stages of pregnancy. It's when the tissue surrounding the spinal cord literally closes over. And if you notice the days of gestation in which this happens, it's before most women even realize they're pregnant. So anybody who is having any possibility of becoming pregnant is usually advised to get on a diet that contains quite a bit of folate, because you need the folate before you become pregnant in order to have it act and reduce the incidence of both spina bifida and a lot of the sources of miscarriages that women go through. What we do in this country is to protect that is enrich a lot of foods with folate. And this will give you some idea of the kinds of foods that are enriched. But anytime you read the word enriched on a label, it means enriched with folic acid or folate. And this is done in quite a few different foods in the United States, because that they have found that it has significantly reduced the birth defects and helped women get through pregnancies. And I really laughed when I was putting this together, because to find out that one of my favorite cookies that I don't eat because of trying to avoid the calories, Oreos are enriched with folic acid, and definitely a good source of folate if you want an excuse to eat Oreos. So what goes on with skin color is that everybody's skin color is a balance of what their ancestors needed in terms of protecting vitamin B9 and allowing enough sunlight through the skin so that vitamin D is produced. And the person that really worked this out fairly recently is Dr. Nina Jablonski, who's a biological anthropologist at Penn State University. Dr. Jablonski is just a real thinker on this. And she worked out that the distributions of skin colors follow this. She wasn't the first one that really came up with this, but she noticed that since the distribution of skin color is patterned in the same way ultraviolet radiation patterns itself with latitude, she saw that correlation. And what she also realized by reading scientific papers, she didn't do the original research on vitamin B9, but she started to pull together the idea that the protection of folate in regions with intense ultraviolet radiation might be one of the factors in making skin colors darker in the regions with high ultraviolet radiation. If you want to read something really good, if this interests you, Dr. Jablonski's book that was, I think was published in 2012, so it's been out for a while, but it's a fabulous book that deals with both the social and the biological aspects of skin color. And I can't recommend anything as much as I would recommend this book. It's a wonderful read. It's not hard. It's not written in dense scientific language. And the only thing that even touches this book is also, and this is a free resource, the Wikipedia site on skin color is very well written. And if you want some quick information after this webinar, the Wikipedia site for skin color also contains very good information. But Dr. Jablonski's book is an even better read. So when we get to the people that exist nowadays and their relationships to their ancestors and skin color, the Khoisan people in Southern Africa are the oldest existing population. And you'll notice that they're not particularly dark skinned. They've got pretty much medium brown skin. This is the tribe that Nelson Mandela belonged to. The Khoi and the San were two different tribes in Africa, but they've ended up being pushed together, and they exist in South Africa now. But those people in Africa that lived closer to the equator had to protect folate. They needed some kind of a melanin a melanin increase. And this is where that gene, the selective sweep of MC1R, really comes into play. Because if the people that are living in equatorial regions really need the protection of vitamin B9 in order to survive and reproduce successfully. So genetic selection went for really dark skin in the latitudes near the equator. But as people migrated away from the equator and went to higher latitudes, and most of the human settlements are in the northern hemisphere, so that's why we usually refer to that. But in higher latitudes, sunlight is more dispersed. There's less ultraviolet radiation, especially at certain times of the year. And people experience shorter days and less direct sunshine. So this kicked in the need for vitamin D to be produced in the skin. And this is why it's presumed that skin lightened as people moved out of Africa. There was a need for the penetration of sunlight, and it wasn't just in European populations. Asian populations have skin that's just about as light as European populations, and genetic selection literally shifted toward genes that controlled and produced much lighter skin so that the ultraviolet radiation that was available could get through and lead to vitamin D production. Now, this is something that scientists refer to as convergent evolution, because the Asians and the Europeans were two completely separate populations. This isn't one led to the other. These two populations were in very different parts of the world. And convergent evolution is when the same kind of an advantage comes about in two unrelated populations. It's what explains why bats and birds and insects have wings. They all evolved that structure separately. They're not related to each other through common ancestors, and wings didn't come about in those species for anything other than the need for flight. What's really, really interesting that came out very recently is there weren't just two groups that became lighter. The Europeans on the right, represented by the woman on the right, and the Asians were only two of the three separate depigmentations that have been documented. This is a Neanderthal, and because they found quite a bit of Neanderthal skeletal material, they were able to extract some DNA out of the tooth of a Neanderthal. And by looking at genes that they know regulate skin color, they now know that Neanderthals must have had very light skin. They used to draw pictures of Neanderthals with fairly dark skin, but anybody who knows what they're doing in anthropology now knows that Neanderthals had fairly light skin. And when I had showed you that map, you could see that they evolved up in Europe and would have had the same need for sunlight penetration that Asians and Europeans did. So skin colors vary quite a bit based on the places that indigenous populations were located. We had intense selection for very dark skin near the equator, intense selection for lighter skin the further you get from the equator, and plenty of populations ranged in the middle of these two extremes, with a lot of people having medium brown skin. Now, here's where I want to shift gears a little bit, because the connection between race and skin color is a huge thing. And race is a very slippery term. Race is something that people, it's never explained really thoroughly in school. So people pick up ideas about race off the street and from whoever they're involved with. And the bottom line is race is something that we need to do a better job of explaining, because human diversity, and especially variation in human skin colors, is not race. The bottom line is that skin color is not coincidental with the racial groupings that people are clustered into. People around the equatorial region, all the way around the world, have darker skin. This is an indigenous Aboriginal person. This is a Southern Indian person. This is a Polynesian woman in Central America. These are where indigenous groups, the original groups that settled in places, developed the darkest skin as protection of vitamin B9. And the variation that's seen all over the world in different skin colors was dependent on solar exposure and only stayed distinctly different as long as populations were genetically isolated. Because anytime human populations come in contact with each other, there's always mixing, and gene pools get sort of combined together. So all of the really distinct differences in skin color were dependent on indigenous populations that lived and stayed in a certain different geographic region of the world. If races were truly distinct, if race was a valid biological term, then genetic traits would sort out geographically. Any particular group on a certain continent would have a set of genes, and their gene pool would be very similar. But what you find out when you look at the genetics of different populations is that this doesn't work. As I've said before, skin color correlates with latitude. We know that the darkest skinned people in indigenous populations are located in the tropics on either side of the equator. So this is a kind of a horizontal distribution of dark skin color, and lighter skin colors exist the further you get away from the equator. But here's where the contradiction comes in, because the ABO blood groups are very easy to quantify and to look at, and the ABO blood groups vary in a longitudinal pattern. Because the ABO blood groups are due to mutations that put antigens on red blood cells, they evolved in different places. And you can see this is the percent of type B blood. The people with the highest, the populations with the highest levels of B are over in Asia. And these and other genetic patterns follow the migration routes of people that moved around the world. Of the original indigenous people, those are the gene pools that make sense. And they verify this over and over by looking at the genetics of populations nowadays with all the modern traits that they have. So the big part of this is that no gene segregates by continent, and there are large overlaps in the gene pools between different groups. There's absolutely no racial distinction in genes whatsoever. A lot of people with dark skin have different genes that cause their skin to be dark. Remember, go think back to the 100 genes that are involved in skin color determination. There's not, having the same skin color doesn't mean you have exactly the same alleles that coded for it. It's a very complex pattern of inheritance. And to add to that, since globalization and people started to move around the world, we no longer have the geographic isolation that kept gene pools separate. Nowadays, people are mixing in all kinds of different ways. And there's a tremendous amount of gene flow going on between populations. Geneticists call this admixture and recombination. But what it's led to is a whole lot of loss of the distinctions in skin colors, and a lot of different genetic combinations can happen as a result of this. So without geographic or social isolation, you get a lot less variation in human skin colors in different groups. And when people mix and produce offspring, you get descent with modification. So these families that show the fact that the genetic traits of the parents are mixed in the production of children that come out of parentage with very different ancestries. So why teach for social justice in a biology classroom? I mean, it's certainly a question that's asked, and I've been asked it by my own boss because students sometimes complain about getting lessons about social justice. And I defend this by saying it's because people think race is biological. They take this term, these divisions that our whole entire human population has been grouped into, and they make out that this is a biological difference, that we're really genetically different. Well, skin color is not an indication of fundamental difference. Skin color is just something that happened as a consequence of ancestry. And when I was in grad school, I was exposed to this quotation by Audre Lorde. And when I kept thinking about racism and the way things happen, her quote and her idea that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, which is a reference to the power structure in our culture, I kept thinking that if there's anything that really should tear down racism, it ought to be scientific ideas. So I operate on the belief that scientific social capital should be used to challenge discrimination. And I have no qualms about doing it in my biology classes. The big thing we need to do now is develop curriculum so it can start much earlier in education. Because understanding the current biological information is going to redefine the reality of race for a lot of people. People's impressions of race are formed on the streets. It's sort of like when people didn't understand reproductive biology and women didn't understand why they got pregnant because they only learned about sex on the streets. And then there was a big push for sex education. If we're not teaching the proper science, then people are not going to understand what the reality is. And even though my training in the natural sciences was always a caution to stay away from social issues, it's sort of just been something that I've given up and actively gone against. Because when I found out about the history of race and how it was developed, I came to the amazing, I had to face the amazing thing that science had not always been objective or value free, in spite of the very claims claims that are made about scientific methodology and all the statistics we use to make sure that everything is really numerically based. The history of science, like a lot of the history that we learn, was most definitely whitewashed. What I mean by this is that scientists actually created race. And it was a distorted view of human variation that occurred about the time that people were moving around and going out and colonizing different parts of the world. I don't think anybody ever stops to think where these colors came from, but when different groups of people are called white, black, brown, red, and yellow, that goes back to Carl Linnaeus, a very famous taxonomist, and one of really the fathers of modern of all biology. And when Carl Linnaeus was writing his 12 editions of Systema Naturae, his famous treatise that classified every living thing in the world, when he finally got to humans, he started to make a lot of references that had to do with different colors of people and had to do with social characteristics more than the kind of objective things that he was using to classify the different plants and animals that were also part of this work. And if you look at these, I'll give you a minute, take a look at this. This is a translation, an actual translation of issue 12 of Systema Naturae. And you can see the things he said about different groups of people. American means American Indians, North American Indians. European is obvious. Asiatic is by number 5, and African is the last group, number 6. But look at the adjectives that he used and the descriptions. Now, unfortunately, this is not easy to find. I found it a long time ago and have kept it. And if anybody wants it for anything because you're teaching or you want to look at it again, just let me know. And I'd be happy to send it to you if you can't find it on the web, because it's not something that's really easy to come by, but it is out there. Scientists that were writing about different groups of people exaggerated animal comparisons. These are typical pictures of the sort of the 18th and 17th centuries. And look at the kinds of things that they did. Another very, very commonly seen picture is this particular one. If you look on the left-hand side at the 3 figures that are drawn over there and the skulls that are right next to them, they're obviously drawings, they're not photographs, but even the skulls are drawn in very distorted ways. The teeth in the Caucasian or the Greek person that's depicted are exactly horizontal. If you draw a line right through the upper and lower teeth, it's very horizontal. The same thing goes for the chimpanzee at the bottom of that column. The teeth are lined up in a very horizontal way. But if you shift your eyes in the middle, you can see that the drawing is done deliberately to distort the whole way the face is oriented. They call it when the lower part of the face is extended, it's called prognathism. And they've gone out of their way to exaggerated prognathism. And if you look at the back of the skulls, look at how high up the back of this skull is, and this one as well. Yet they tipped the skull back so that it was literally distorting the way the whole face looked in this particular skull. So they made these animal connections and literally put together these stories that do not make sense and are not true. These are some of these, I think all 4 of these skulls are actually plastic casts, but they're actual casts of the original skulls of these people and these species. And you can see that the human skulls are much more alike each other than they are like the orangutan and the chimpanzee. Just for a little test, these are people from 4 different ancestral groups. And if I'm in a classroom, I usually ask my students, can anybody racialize these? Can you tell which one goes with which racial ethnic group? And most people are not going to take a try at this, but here they are. It's impossible to racialize these different skulls, although sometimes it's said that people, if you watch the crime TV shows, they'll walk up to a dead or a skeleton of a dead person and say, oh, I can tell this is a such and such and such and such. Those people that are doing those kind of studies, the forensics analysts do have ways they can recognize certain traits, but it's not as easy as they make it look on television by any means. So the dehumanization of other people was used as a justification for slavery that was building up and going on at this period of time. And if you're not really aware of the history of Africa, Africa was being colonized so rampantly by Europeans that by 1914, there were only 2 countries in all of the African continent that were not controlled by some European nation. So what this starts to, what I try to explain to my students is that race is a socio-cultural proposition. And people have been led to believe that it's biologically justified, but there's absolutely no way that it is. I'll let you read this for yourself. And the bottom line is, from a biological standpoint, race has no validity whatsoever. There are no taxa or categories below the level of species. There's no such thing as subspecies in Homo sapiens. Yet socially, race is very real. And I would never give this talk without making the point and making it very clear that this is a cultural reality, not a biological one. One of the things that's really important to talk about is the fact that claiming to be colorblind does not end racism. A lot of my students always want to say, I have a Black friend or I'm colorblind. And claiming to be colorblind doesn't do anything for this situation that exists in this country. Because if you say you don't see color, what it means is that you don't recognize racism. Anyone who knows anything about what people that are not part of the dominant group, which is Caucasian, obviously, doesn't know what kinds of experiences other people are having. And this is the systemic racism that's being challenged right now. This long overdue national reckoning that during the civil rights era had Black people protesting at the Capitol is now being joined by Caucasians that recognize that the systemic racism and the way people of color are treated is not something that we should allow to happen as Americans. And even though we've had an African-American president, we did not suddenly become a post-racial America. Skin color really just can't be a marker of human difference. It doesn't make a difference. It's very superficial. And I was really excited to read very recently in an email that Mount Holyoke's got a new anti-racist action plan. And this is a quote that I took out of it. And as usual, I'm very proud of our alma mater. I remember when I was a freshman in Torrey in 1973, how we sat in the halls and the African-American students told us how relieved they were that they had been assigned Black roommates because they had never spent a lot of time around white people before they were going up to Mount Holyoke, and how comforting it was to have Black roommates. And the next year when I was a sophomore in Wilder, I remember that the African-American students at Mount Holyoke were trying to work with the administration to get a place where they could meet and literally spend time together in their own kind of environment. And a lot of people didn't understand that, and they weren't getting a very good reception. And this would have been, what, 74, 75. So it wasn't getting a very good reception. Yet now Mount Holyoke has wonderful policies with respect to students of color. But the best thing that ever happened to me at Mount Holyoke was that when I had to take the distribution requirement for a humanities class, I found out that there was a professor at Mount Holyoke that had won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. I guess he'd won 1 Pulitzer Prize when I was there. And I took a course on Southern history from Professor William McFeely. And Roll Jordan Roll was our textbook, and he sent us to the slave narratives to write papers. And I will never forget the impression this made on me way back, what is almost 50 years ago. I had a chance to write him a thank you note recently, and luckily I did so about a year before he died. But I wanted to tell him that I was now a college professor and how much I still remembered and still had that book on my bookshelf in the office. So what I'm trying to say with this is we can help reframe our culture. And in the words of one of the most wonderful women that ever lived in this country,